There we go. Okay, so the next chapter is actually Passover, but I think we're going to skip that one because Passover, is coming up 6 weeks or something like that. So we'll get to that later. So we have an interesting topic today. Our topic is God, and so that's why we're going to need to chat a little bit because it's complex and personal, right? And so there'll be moments where I'll invite you to chat. Well, there's only a few of us. Maybe we can just speak instead, whichever way you're comfortable. All right, getting better at this. Here we go. So class number 8. This is God. Yes, and so already we'll just stick on this cover page for a moment. So the cover page has a couple of things on it that I find interesting. Number one, sometimes in traditional Judaism, we don't spell the name of God. You ever seen that before? G-D is how people sometimes do it. So why do they do that? Well, the name of God is holy and sacred. So we don't want to use it in everyday secular language. We want to reserve the name God for holy purposes, maybe in a siddur, maybe in a prayer book, or in a chumash, in a Bible text. But if we're just writing a paragraph or writing a speech, a sermon, then we don't need to write the name God, and it's not really a sacred space. And then a lot of people do G-D. I don't, and the Miller curriculum also does not, because we see the name of God in English, G-O-D, as removed from the sacred names of God. And so one example is Yud, Hey, Vav, Hey, right? It's the 4-letter name of God. I believe it's called the Tetramagon or something like that. The 4-letter holy name of God, Yud, Hey, Vav, Hey. So that I'm careful with. And sometimes it's spelled Yud, Yud. I'm also careful with that one. Right? And if when they're found in a sacred text and we have God's holy name in a sacred text, when the book gets used up, when it reaches its time to be, either it's ripped or dirty or, we just can't, unusable. What we do is we take it and we bury it, right? And we go to a cemetery and we bury it because we really consider it holy. Right? And so we do that here at the synagogue. People bring in their old books, and then I have to determine whether they're sacred, need to be buried, or we can just recycle them or give them away, depending on their state. And so that's the name of God, a little bit of background there. And then as you can see, the picture is, those light rays that shoot out from the sky, right? And so a couple of things about that. Number one is, that's not God. Right. So God is not the rays that sometimes shoot out from the clouds, although it's, very dramatic and beautiful. That's not God, right? And God is also not, we'll talk a little bit about what's not God so that we can understand what God is. God is also not an old dude sitting on a throne, right? So that's also not God. But we can sometimes experience divinity and experience sacred moments when, miracles happen, right? When things are miraculous, right? Out of the ordinary and so beautiful that our heart moves, right? But again, that's not God, but that's opens up our consciousness, right? That there's something larger at play, right? And so the sunset isn't God, right? The sunset reminds us that there are miracles in this world and the cosmos is so awesome. And, why are we here? And what's our purpose, right? So it can trigger and invite holy moments, right? But we have to remember that that's not God, right? And so there's a story, a Hasidic story, that the Hasidic master was sitting around a table. No, there we go. I can't admit. The holy master was sitting around a table and invited his students over for a nice Friday night dinner. In the middle of it, they're enjoying themselves, they're singing songs and eating nice food. And all of a sudden, the rabbi looks at the students and says, "Where is God? Where can God be found?" Right? And everybody sort of I don't know, in the sunset, at the birth of a child, when we're learning Torah deeply, right? He says, no, that's not God. So how do we find God? Whenever we let God in. Right? And so that's the idea, right? When we're looking at these triggers, it's a moment for us to be able to let God in. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about, what is God? What does it mean to be a person of faith? And learn a little bit about the scope and the landscape of God. All right. And so here we go. All right. So here is a belief in God in the American population. And we have some Pew studies, right, that help us, right, that ask, are you a believer in God? Right. And in what, how much, right? Certain, not so certain, somewhere in the middle, don't believe in God, right? And so they find some interesting statistics that can inform us about, the landscape of belief in God. It's a little bit small, so I'll read it out. American Jews, right, is on the left. 28% don't believe in God. Right? 38% believe, but are less certain, somewhere on the fence, right? And 34% strongly believe in God. Right? So that's American Jews, right? So again, it's about, I'm no mathematician, but it's about evenly split, right? 33% is sort of the average here, right? So a lot of American Jews don't believe in God. A lot of American Jews are on the fence, and a lot of American Jews strongly believe in God. So we have a nice, healthy mix, right? From believers in God, non-believers in God, and sort of believers in God, right? So that's American Jews. American Christians are a whole different story, right? So strongly believe in God, 78%, 78.8, 79%. Right, so that's more than double. Is it triple? No, more than double of Christians believe in God than Jews. Right, so Christians are believers, right, for the most part. 20% believe, but are less certain, which is fair, right? They're still believers, but they're kind of on the fence. 2% do not believe. Right, so 28% of Jews don't believe, and 2% of Christians don't believe. Right, that's the dramatic, information there. So now we have one more category, which is American non-religious. So these are the people that say, are you religious or not religious? Are you a member of a faith or not? And the answer is no, I'm not religious. So it's a little confusing, right? So we'll talk a little bit about that. American non-religious, they don't have a faith, right? They don't have a system or a structure, right? So 32% don't believe, which makes a lot of sense. 38% believe, but are less certain. And 30% strongly believe in God, right? So 1/3 of non-religious Americans strongly believe in God. So that's a surprising statistic, yeah. So how do we compare American Jews to American non-religious people? About the same, right? So, that speaks, volumes about Judaism and Christianity, and and how American non-religious compare with American Jews, right? So one might even say, well, Jews are not religious, right? Jews are, right? So that's just an interesting statistic. And so how are we supposed to deal with that, right? So let's start with the Christians, right? So to be a good Christian, right, what do you have to do, right? So first of all, you have to come to church, right? You're called a church goer, right? That's what makes you a Christian, is you're a church goer, right? It's almost synonymous with American Christianity. So that's one thing. You're at church every Sunday and sometimes Wednesday, or you're at church a lot, and so that strongly believe in God. You're in church, you're hearing about God, you're praying to God, right? You're involved in God on a weekly basis. And so it makes sense that they would strongly believe in God. Believe but less certain also kind of makes sense, right? I'll call that believe, right? Do not believe is only 2%, right? Because you can't really be a good Christian unless you have faith, unless you're, believe that you're going to be saved, right? And so that's what makes a good Christian. I'm saved, right? And then you're a Christian, right? So I don't mean to belittle that. I apologize. It's much more complicated than that. But there you go, right? So belief in God is sort of a criterion for being a good Christian. Okay, now let's go to American Jews, right? That's not true for American Jews, right? So, what percent of even Bris Shalom membership attend synagogues on a regular basis? Very small percentage, right? Everybody comes for high holidays, of course, but very few people come regularly to Shabbat services, right? And so, that sort of contributes. When you're not interacting with God or prayer or spirituality on a regular basis, right, then, that leads to being a non-believer, right? Believe but less certain, right, also makes sense. Strongly believe in God makes sense, but the interesting part is the do not believe. So they're asked the question, do you have a faith? Are you religious? The answer is yes. Do you believe in God? The answer is no, right? For 30% of American Jews, right? So what does that mean? How is that even possible? Well, being Jewish is more than being religious, right? You can be a perfectly good Jew without being religious, right? You give tzedakah, you give charity, you're a member, you're on the board of the Jewish Community Center, you have Jewish friends, you celebrate the high holidays, you're Jewish, you're Israel, you're a Zionist, right? There's so many different ways of connecting to Judaism other than faith, right? And so that's how you can be a perfectly good Jew and have a very strong Jewish identity without being a believer in God, right? And so in the 60s, 70s, even today, right, there was a movement towards Buddhism, right? Jew-boo, right? So you're who are seeking more spirituality, right? Back when Judaism was not so spiritual, right? Formal services and, a little bit uptight and highbrow and not so spiritual. There's been a spiritual revolution in the past couple of decades, but before that, a lot of the Jews who were seeking spirituality, right, especially in the 60s, right, gravitated towards Buddhism, right? Why? Well, because it's spiritual, it's meditation, open and comfortable, right? And so here's a joke about that issue. You ready for that? It's Jewish jokes have wisdom behind them, right? So here you go. There was a monk who lived on a mountaintop, and the Buddhists used to go and make pilgrimage to their master, right? And here was the deal: you're only allowed to speak 3 words to the master, right? And maybe he would reply, maybe he wouldn't. But as you climb up the mountain, you have to come up with 3 words to speak with the master. And so hundreds, thousands of people made the pilgrimage up to the mountaintop. And one elderly woman once came. Usually they were young people who were fit, who could make their way up the mountain. But one elderly woman, it took a long time to get up the mountain. And finally, when she arrived, she sat down in front of the monk. And, the monk's attendants said, what are your 3 words? And her 3 words are, Harvey, come home. Right. And so actually a lot of the, leaders of Buddhist temples are Jewish, right? They took, Buddhist names, but a lot of them were seeking spirituality, right? They were part of this category of American Jews, right? Who were spiritual, but not religious, right? They don't believe in God, but they still want some connection with each other, connection with the divine, connection with their own spirit, right? And so these were the American Jews who did not believe in God, who were still seeking some spirituality, right? And so let's go to the American non-religious on the right, right? So there's a common phrase that I hear as a rabbi, right? Even when I'm on an airplane and I tell people what I do, right? Oftentimes, the confessions come, well, I used to be, my parents made Kiddush, but I don't really do Friday, right? So they not only connect with, they want to connect with the rabbi, but they also apologize that they're not religious, right? And I say, it's okay. Right? But the American non-religious, there's a common phrase that I hear on the airplanes also, which is, Rabbi, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. Yes. Had you heard that term, right? I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious, right? Which is a perfectly acceptable way of being in Judaism. However, as a rabbi, as a conservative rabbi, who believes in both keva and kavanah, right? So you heard last time, right? So those are the two polarities of prayer. There also can be polarities of faith, right? So being spiritual is having all the intentionality. All right, I want to be spiritual. I want to be close with the cosmos. I want to be conscious of the world around me, environmentalism, right? All this kind of stuff. This important, essential work that we do, but I'm not religious, right? And so what I would contend is that it's hard to be spiritual without having a context, without having a formula, without having a discipline, right? And so that's from a rabbinic perspective, right? That being spiritual but not religious is a challenge, right? Because it doesn't have a form, it doesn't have a discipline, right? And so that's what I would say to the American Jews who want more spirituality in their lives, but don't seem to know how to get it, right? And so belief in God in the American population is very interesting and telling about what it means to be a Jew, right? And so there are many ways to be Jewish. One of them is through faith. One of them is through God. All right, so let's describe what it means to have a typically Jewish connection with God. Or before we do, right, I have a prayer. Let's go back there first. No, yeah, let's go back to there for a second. There are prayers in our prayer book that help us connect with God, right? They give us the keva, they give us the structure, right, for faith and for spirituality. And so one of the prayers that we say reminded me of this picture. So here's the prayer. I'll read it in English. Praised are you, Adonai, our God, who rules the universe. Your word brings the evening dusk, right? And so behind all this, right, is God, right? God creating the cosmos. All right, you open with wisdom the gates of dawn, right? Sunrise is even more miraculous than sunset. You open with wisdom the gates of dawn. Design the day with wondrous skill. This is God as creator. Set the succession of seasons and arrange the stars in the sky according to your will. Adonai, you create day and night, rolling light away from darkness and darkness away from light. Eternal God, praised are you for each evening's dusk, right? And that's part of our evening prayers, right? And so, right, you can see that these special moments in time can remind us, our portals for us to experience the divine. All right, so that's one aspect of God is prayer. Here's another one. So in the Bible, in the Torah, in Genesis, and Jacob was left alone, right? So Jacob, we heard of Jacob's ladder, right? Jacob was a man of the night, right? He was a dreamer, and he had visions. And here's either a vision or an incident. It's up to us to decide. The incident means it really happened this way, right? Or a vision means it was almost like a dream. So you decide. Here we go. And Jacob was left alone. He sent his family. He's about to confront his brother Esau, with whom they were arch enemies at this point, right? Because of their fighting as kids about the birthright. And so, right, he was about to confront the biggest confrontation of his entire life. So he sent his family over the river, and Jacob was left alone. And a man wrestled with him until the break of dawn. All night long, they were wrestling. When he saw that he had not prevailed against him, when the man saw that couldn't win, he wrenched Jacob's hip at its socket, so that the socket of his hip was strained as he wrestled with him. Right? He gave him a serious break in the hip. Then he said, "Let me go, for dawn is breaking." So the man said, "Let me go. Right? It's almost morning." It's almost like Dracula, right? The vampire, right? Hitting the sunlight. But he answered, "I will not let you go until you bless me," said Jacob. Said the other, "What is your name?" He replied, "Jacob." Said he, "You shall no longer be Jacob, but Yisrael, for you have wrestled with God and man, and you have prevailed." Right? So Yisrael means wrestling. Jacob said, "Tell me your name." And he said, "You must not ask my name." So this man or being or vision didn't have a name. And he took leave of him there. So Jacob called this place Peniel, meaning I have encountered God face to face, yet my life has been preserved. Right? So this is where Yisrael gets its name. So before this, we were called Israelites. Right? The Israelites were slaves in Egypt. But at this point, this is the moment where we become Israelites. I'm sorry, this is when we become, what do we call it? Yisrael. Yisrael, right? So B'nai Yisrael. And Jacob has 12 sons who became the 12 tribes and one daughter. And this is where we become B'nai Yisrael. And so here's the question. Did this happen? Was it a night vision? Was it a dream? Right? Was it a struggle? So in the Torah, the word man is ish, right? So it doesn't say an angel came to wrestle. It says a man came, right? And so that's the confusion. And so you can see the painting on the left, right? So what does that painting indicate, right? On one hand, the angel, well, first you see the hip socket being ripped, right? And so that's no good. Which one's which? Yeah, it's hard to tell which one's which. What do you think? All right, so it's a little ambiguous. You have to work out the wrestling move. But the point is, the face is like a man, but there's wings involved, right? So it's an angel, it's a man, and I would posit it's all of them, right? That the Torah is written ambiguously on purpose so that we can engage in this conversation, right? So on one hand, it's a spiritual being because it's an angelic, it has wings, right? And so that's an angel. I said it because, right, it's nor he or she if it's an angel. Number two, or it's a man, right? And it has a face. He has a face. There you go. Watch my pronouns. And then there are others who think that he's wrestling with his own consciousness, right? And so Jacob, the claim is that he stole the birthright and he tricked his father-in-law Lavan as he left by taking a lot of the sheep and this negotiation. And he was a bit of a trickster, right? As we would say in literary devices, especially Native American. But the trickster, right, is a common theme. And this is where he comes to Moses, right? This is his moment where he has to deal with that emotionally and spiritually. And so some say it's his own consciousness, right? And what's interesting about that is we all have a consciousness, right? It makes it a eternal story. And so in Judaism, to be in relationship with God doesn't mean full faith, right? So it means wrestling with God. So this is the name given to Jacob, Israel, in Genesis 32. That becomes the name of the Jewish people. Instead of Yisraelim, it becomes right? Well, here there's Yisrael, B'nai Yisrael, become the children of Israel. And number 3, wrestles with God. That's the important piece, is that right, we become God wrestlers. So what's the difference between a person of faith and a God wrestler? Well, we question our rituals. Why do we do this, right? We have the 4 questions at the Passover table. We question our rituals, we question our philosophy, right? We ask questions and we struggle with our faith in God, right? Why did God do this, right? How come this world is like it is if God is good, right? And God is all powerful. Why is the world like it is? And we have to wrestle with that answer, right? And God is hidden from us, right? When the temples were up and our ancestors were walking this earth, there was certainty. People were talking to God, right? In the temple, we had a direct connection with God, but now that the temples are destroyed, we're in the diaspora, God's face is hidden, right? And so that's a problem, right? When it comes to faith, right? It's hard to have this kind of God consciousness all the time, right? And so we have a couple different, we can compare faiths, right? Here is our 3 major faiths that we deal with a lot. There are a lot of other ones, but in Islam, right, the goal is to submit to God. Christianity becomes a follower of God. And in Judaism, and B'nai Yisrael, we are wrestlers with God. And so there are strengths and weaknesses, and they call it strengths and challenges, right, with each of these goals, right? So let's go through it a little bit. So maybe unmute if you want to add something. So strengths of being a submitter to God and weaknesses of being submitter to God. I'll think of a strength. The strength is, right, pure faith, right? You have pure faith and you're all in, right? All your chips are in at this point if you submit yourself to God. So what are the weaknesses of being a submitter to God?
Not much choice.
Good. So you don't end up with a lot of freedom, right? And choice, right? So in Judaism, right, we have the denominations, we have, right, all kinds of ways that we can engage with Judaism, and we have a lot of choice and freedom. I'm kind of selling Judaism here, which isn't right, but we'll get to the weaknesses also with being a God wrestler. So there you go. So that's submitting to God. In Christianity, we follow God. So strengths and weaknesses. So strengths, again, I think you're all in, and it's easier. I shouldn't say easier. It's more simple, right, to be a follower of God than a wrestler of God. I'm comparing it a lot to Judaism, right? Just because I'm Jewish, right? And to be a follower of God seems to be a more simple approach, less complex than what we have. So that's a strength. A challenge, similar, right? There's not a lot of choices. Any other nuances that you can think of? Follower of God. Right. Also, I think it puts, there's a serious hierarchy between God as the leader and we're the follower. Whereas in Judaism, it's a little more complex. Yeah, Bill.
With 613 commandments, though, aren't we partially a follower of God?
Very good. Thank you for being a critical thinker, which is important in Judaism, right?
Yes.
So we are also followers of God in some respect, and we have it in our prayers, right? God, you're the shepherd, and we're the sheep, and right, we have that on high holidays a lot. God is king, right? Yes. So let's move to Israel, what it means to be a wrestler with God. Well, Bill presents that it's a little more complex than that. So yes, at the high holidays and in moments of, what's the word? Deep prayer, we have a tradition of God as commander, right? And we hear a lot about that, especially on the high holidays, because we're doing a kingship kind of thing. It's called a coronation. It takes after the ancient annual coronation of the king. And so that's the historical context for that. However, right, there are many other prayers. Ahava rabba avtanu, you love us with a deep love, right? And so, right before the Shema and right after the Shema, which is a really important part of our service, we have a love relationship, right? Which I think is really interesting and important and underemphasized, right? So God, you have loved us with an eternal love. We're lovers, right? Which seems to imply mutuality, right? Yedid nefesh, right? There's a lot of underemphasized mutual relationships with God. But yes, but it's complex, right? At different times in our lives, at different times in the year, our relationship with God shifts. Yes. Yeah.
When I saw Wrestler with God, what I thought of was, the old line, with two Jews, you have three opinions.
Right.
Because Wrestler with God, there's a certain greater independence.
Right.
Different view than being a follower or submitter.
Yes.
And that fits within two Jews, three opinions.
Yes, right. And also fits in with the flexibility, right, that I have, right, certainly the conservative movement and the reform movement. We have a lot of flexibility, right? And so that's more of a wrestler with God. Yes, but thank you, Bill, for bringing up that point, which is, right, it's not that simple. It's not that simple for Christianity. It's not that simple for Islam, and it's not that simple for Judaism. I guess we're trying to simplify on a PowerPoint. So that's a weakness of that slide, right? So yes, we're talking about wrestling with God, and we're talking about sort of a questioning Judaism, but there are certain principles of faith that are important, right? The Shema is one of them. And the Shema, right, we're supposed to recite it twice a day when we wake up and when we go to sleep, right? And the last words that we speak in our life is, supposed to be a recitation of the Shema. But listen up, God wrestlers, right? Shema Yisrael. So this is a contemporary. Bill, the other thing I should mention is, right, there are in the contemporary Judaism, like starting in the 60s and 70s, right, there has been a shift between God as commander and God as mutual companion, right? And so, yeah, I think that the more contemporary you get, the more mutual that our theology becomes, right? And so, this is a translation in a contemporary new prayer book. Usually here, "Hear, O Israel, our God's," right? But here we see, "Listen up, God wrestlers," right? That's Yud Hey Vav Hey is the name of God that we use, which sounds a lot like Jehovah, right? It's from Jehovah's Witnesses. Yeva, right? And also sounds like a breath, some people say, right? So it sounds like a breath in some sense, right? Is our God. The name of God is one. And so one can mean many things, right? Right. Actually, Vicky, my wife, tells the story in preschool. She was doing some teaching, and we said, "God is one, God is one, God is one." The preschooler asked, "When is God going to be two?" Right. So it's a little unclear what one means, right? So in the past, right, and traditionally, it means singular, right? We are monotheists, right, instead of polytheists, right? So that's where it comes from. That's the root of it. But our more mystical and contemporary understanding is that God is all, like everything is one, which is part of our tradition also in our prayer book. There is no place devoid of God. God, you are everything and you are everywhere, and everything is connected, right? So there's two ways to look at a beach, right? So one way to look at it is distinct. There's water and there's sand, and there's a line of division between the two, right? The other way to look at it is there's the ocean and there's sand, and the line in between is the connector, right? And so that's sort of a more Jewishly theological way of looking at things, that all is one, right? That we're all moving along this timeline, right? We're all like drops in a giant ocean, and we're all one. We usually see us as us, and you, me as me, and you as you. But the holiness comes when we see each other connected in a community and on the planet, right? Again, we have our countries and continents are all divided. What would it look like if instead of divided, we see them as connected? So that's another way to look at God is one. So the other important thing in Judaism is God is both transcendent and immanent. So transcendent means above all, right? And that's the commander of 613 mitzvot, right? Transcendent and cosmic, but also immanent with us. We have a personal relationship with God. God took us out of Egypt, right? God is involved in history and in our lives, right? So that seems to be a contradiction, but God is one, right? God be at both transcendent and immanent. So here's the Adonai Lamb, which is a beautiful prayer that teaches about this issue. And Adonai Lamb is one of our final prayers in the prayer service. And a lot of times, especially in traditional places, it's our time to get up and start moving towards the Kiddush, right? But unfortunately, it has a really beautiful theology that's behind it. So here we see the combination of transcendence and immanence, right? So the Eternal One ruled before. Adonai Lamb really means master of eternity. Master of eternity. The Eternal One ruled before the birth of every living thing. When God made all according to God's will, then God was known as King, right? So King is our transcendent, as Bill points out. But when all is ended, God will reign alone in awesome majesty. God was, God is, God will be, glorious for all eternity, right? So God is beyond time, right? So imagine you can see time as like a linear, you're separate from time, right? This is God's perspective of time. And you can see it all laid out in front of you. Like we see space, God sees time, right? And so there's no then, now, in the future, in the past, it's all one. There we go with the oneness again, past, present, and future. Hard to imagine. Peerless and unique is God. There's also God is one, with none at all to be compared, right? There's no comparison, right? God is like this or God is like that. God is unique, beginningless and endless too. God's vast dominion is not shared, right? And then there's a shift to the immanence. God is my God and my Redeemer, my refuge in times of struggle, right? This is the first time we see the word my, right? So it switches perspective. God is my support and my shelter, the one who fills my cup when I call. Into God's hand, I place my spirit when I wake and when I sleep. God is with me, body and soul. God is with me. I have no fear, right? I'm not afraid, right? And so Bi'ado Kidruchi, into the last paragraph, is a paragraph that we cite during our end of life confessional, right? Because, when I wake and when I sleep can mean going to bed and waking up, but also can mean eternal, waking and sleeping. So God is with me, body and soul. God is with me, and so I'm not afraid, right? God gives us inspiration. God gives us perspective and purpose, right? And so that's a very personal perspective of what God is. So again, we have the transcendent, God above all time, and is with us. So both of those are somehow true at the same time. There are 49, at least 49 names of God. And so take a moment and read through the list if it's big enough. Right, here's some of how we refer to God. And I think you can see that there's so many different perspectives of God, right? So God is one, but God has different faces, right? There's a beautiful children's book by a guy last name Sasso Right, the farmer sees God, as the maker of sun and rain. Right, the water carrier sees God as the giver of strength. Right, and so there's another interesting take on this, which is in the Amidah, in our standing, powerful, most intimate prayer, our silent prayer, we pray, blessed are you, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob, God of Sarah, God of, right? And God of. So why not just say God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Rebekah, Rachel, Leah? That's a little more concise, a little less wordy. But the answer is, from our rabbis, is that the relationship that Abraham with God is different than the relationship that Sarah had with God. Right? And you can go through the whole list. Each one of them had their own unique relationship with God. Right? And so these names help support that idea. Right? On one hand, right, you've got where is it? King, right? You've got El Norah, terrifying one, right? Which could also be, right? You can translate in that different ways. Awesome one, right? Highest God. Right? But on the other hand, right, you've got the infinite, healer, wellspring of life, right? And so also in a contemporary, well, it goes back a long way, but especially in the renewal movement, they emphasize the feminine aspects of God. Right? Usually we have a male perspective of God because of the language, because of commander, right? And king, not queen, right? But we have a lot of examples in our text, right? The Sabbath bride, the Sabbath queen, the Shekhinah is the feminine presence of God. There it is, number 39, is becoming more and more contemporary as we get more and more egalitarian. Shekhinah is the presence, right? And it goes back a long way, especially in mystical circles. And that's a feminine presence of God, a nurturing, right, presence of God, right? All those sort of stereotypical aspects, the feminine aspects, instead of the masculine. Man of war, right, is Ish Milchama, right? And so we have a nice balance, right, of the two. And so that instructs us and teaches us about the many ways that we ourselves have the opportunity to connect with God. All these lists, right? And it's so different, right? And so unique. And we all need God in different ways. And we can all connect with God in different ways. Right, so here's an example of it from a rabbinic text. God's speech, right? When God talked to us at Mount Sinai, God's speech came to every individual according to their capacity. Right? Similarly, when the manna descended for Israel, the food that God fed us in the desert, tasted differently to everyone. To the infants, it tasted like mother's milk. To the young, it tasted like bread and oil and honey. To the elders, it tasted like wafers made of honey. In that same way, that the manna tasted different in everyone's mouth, according to their uniqueness, so each individual heard God's speech according to their uniqueness. Right? So you can say, right, God is all and one, but God has different faces, right, for what we do in our lives and what we need from God. So rabbis were asked to write 100-word theologies. I think there's 4 or 6 of them. There's 6 of them. We'll read 3. Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg, my theology is, I don't know. Right? So there's that religious but not certain, even coming from a rabbi, right? Because she's describing her struggle, her wrestling with God. I've had powerful experiences of transcendence that, as I interpret them, substantiate my sense of the divine as the vast interconnectedness of all being. Maybe more than that, but am I right? Right? Is that correct? Am I right? I'll never be sure. We have to engage theology with humility and an awareness that things may be messy and complex as we try to make sense of ultimate reality from a deeply subjective place, right? It's almost hubris to think that we can figure out God. Our understandings reflect the imperfect filters through which we view the world. I'm always suspicious of those who claim certainty or that they have all the answers. Right? And so that's our mainstream Jewish approach. I think she verbalized it really well. However, there are those that aren't satisfied with that, particularly our mystical communities, which want to know God. They want to know why God. They want to know what our purpose is. And so I've been studying Kabbalah a little bit with a friend who's a Kabbalist in Tzfat and getting a little bit of taste of what that means. But just know that there are others in Judaism who demand to know what God is and have a Kabbalah and have a tradition that helps us do that. Rabbi Deborah Silver, I continuously fall in and out of relationship with God. When I feel most alienated, I often find that I've been using unhelpful metaphors, hero, king, father. Sometimes changing them helps. Mystery, that's one that we haven't seen. Compassion, and we use that in Birkat Hamazon. Harachaman, right, is one of the words, one of the names of God, which means the merciful one. It comes up a lot in Islam, right? Rahmana, right? I don't know any other example, right? Arakem, right? Rahmana Arakem is very similar to Hamrachem, Harachaman Hamrachem, which we have in our own prayers, right? So there's some intersection there, that intersectionality that we really haven't talked about between the three major denominations, but even they can fall short. As my interfaith study partner taught me to say, the living God has moved on. The name can never be pronounced ever. Where is God in all this? There are some moments when I have felt seen or trusted, but I can live off the energy of those for a long time, right? That's interesting, right? Right, and she's bringing a contemporary context, right? That maybe our relationship with God in the contemporary world is different, right? As we grow up, right? Part of the story of the Bible is us growing up, right? At first we were infants that needed to be fed in the desert and carried through the desert like babies, right? And then slowly but surely in rabbinic times, rabbis started getting empowered almost like teenagers or young adults, right? And maybe we're ready to be grown-ups, right? And have a grown-up relationship with God, like, right? Like parents and grown-up children. Rabbi Eli Spitz, dear God, our relationship, so he decided to write a prayer to God. Our relationship is more grounded in emotion and to intuition than analytical thought. I call on you to express my yearnings, my fears, my gratitude, right? So we often, even in our lesson today, we try to analyze and figure out God with our heads, but he's saying that's not where God is at. God is in the heart. I call on you to express my yearnings, my fears, my gratitude. And when I do that, I feel closer to you because I believe that you care and you listen, right? Yeah, let's move on. We got the point there that God is less about the head and more about the heart, right? And so these are some of the questions that I encourage you to ask yourselves, right? So have a conversation with someone after this session, right? And have a havruta, have a pairing, right? What do you think the answer is? Here's what I'm thinking. Right? To me, God is what? Right? And so you don't need to answer that now because it'll probably take some thought, right? To me, God is, and some conversation, right? To me, God isn't this or that, right? Some of my questions about God are, right? So that encourages sort of helping realize and substantiate God in our lives, right? To me, God is, right? To me, God isn't, right? Just brings us a little more clarity about misconceptions of God. And the third one, right, encourages that wrestling that we've been talking about, right? How can God do this? Why is this the way it is? Some of my questions about God are, dot. All right, so let's stop there and I'll take some questions if there are any specific questions. or comments? It's kind of a tough topic to engage in. And right, so we got some context, got a little bit of analytics, right? And my hope moving forward is right to build an emotional relationship with God. And my prayer and hope, right, is that this course will help on that journey of developing a relationship and a prayer life, right? That's meaningful and effective. Yes.
Renown?
Yeah. Rabbi. Yeah.
Have there been?
It's my father-in-law. Yes.
Yeah, I'm Manny.
Yeah. I'm
have
Rabbi
there
Teller.
been-
Yeah, for this class.
Right. We're close.
That's
Question.
fine.
There must have been Jews do studies all over the place. The question of, for those people who believe there is a God, what portion of those or proportion are believe that there's a personal God as opposed to the God not being a personal God? Has anyone looked at that you know of?
Yeah, not that I know of, but my instinct says I think you're correct in what I'm hearing is, and let me check that. Do you think it's right? That most people think about God as creator, right? And then there's Aristotelian and Plato, who said God is the unmoved, mover, right? That God created the earth and then just sent it on its way. So I think there's a lot of people that believe that. And I would say that's probably most because it's so common in Western theology. But less common, right, would be this kind of personal relationship with God. And it's more difficult, right, I would posit, than believing in, an all-powerful, awesome God. It's a little more challenging and takes more work and discipline to develop that kind of relationship with God, particularly through the vehicles of prayer and just consciousness, right? Carrying God with you, right? I once shadowed a Catholic colleague, and one of the fantastic, well, two things I point out about that. One is when it was time we shared a lunch together back in the day when you could do that. And so we each said, okay, why don't you say a prayer? Why don't you say a prayer? And my prayer, of course, was Hamotzi Lachem min haaretz. Thank you, God, for bringing forth bread from the earth. And his was, I can't really do it, but Holy Father, thank you for this opportunity to break bread with a colleague. I know you, and he went on and on and on in this poetry, which was so beautiful, right? And then when I started shadowing him, at every meeting that he had, he did the same thing. Holy Father, thank you for bringing us together so that we can, enhance and in the church, like a beautiful, spontaneous prayer, right? And I think that's part of the challenge of our Judaism, is that we have the set prayers, right, that don't encourage personal prayer, right? And so that's something that we need to work on, right, beyond our prayer book, to use the prayer book as a launching pad. Right? Some people say, like Mr. Hasidim, right, will say, you just take one sentence of the prayer book and stay there. You don't have to keep going when the rabbi says page this or page that. You can just sit and meditate, right, and try to develop a larger consciousness, right, and reach out. And so that's part of our challenge. And yes, I think, is that what you're asking? That you would assume most people have a?
Well, I'm not sure, personal is not personal, but the one thing you run into with a personal God is the Holocaust. How do you explain it?
Right. If God is up there and not really involved in the everyday, then how do you explain when terrible things happen in the world? Right. And that's a problem that, right, all these books on the shelf, address in some way.
Kushner's books.
Yeah. And so, maybe we'll talk a little bit about that next time. Theosophy, I think it's called, right? How can bad things, right? And so the book, the most popular is Harold Kushner, right? Who wrote the book When Happen to Good People. Everyone, usually it's misquoted. Right, when bad things are going to be.
Why do bad things?
Why do they? Thank you. Why do bad things? It doesn't say why. It says when. How do you respond when this happens? But you can never. He doesn't approach the why. He approaches the when. So it's more practical advice, but it talks about the personal God, and right. His opinion is God doesn't do that. God doesn't meddle in everyday things. God is the surviving. God is in the resilience. God is in the heroes, but God isn't in the evil. Right? We have to have human freedom, right, and choice in order to be human beings and reach our potential, and that comes with consequences. So that's right, Harold Kushner in a nutshell. But he's one of many people that try to address this issue. Right, and I address it personally in my pastoral care. Right, why did God do this to my child? Why did God do this to me? And my answer is, well, that's medicine, right? That's not God. That's science. That's genetics. That's biology, but that's not God, right? So I sort of share his opinion in moments of pastoral care. And thank you all for being here. Yes, and
Thank
for
you.
asking questions.
Thank you.
And thank you all who are watching virtually and asynchronously. Okay. See you
Thank
soon.
you.